So I thought I'd do a quick video on a solution, or one of the solutions, to the foot control issues that some of us are experiencing. I find that sometimes it's just a matter of readjusting the little board inside, but you might need a little help on knowing what to look for and how to get to it. So you just need a regular screwdriver and a Phillips screwdriver and your bad foot control. Remember, we're not going to have this plugged into the machine while we're working on it because there is a board inside, and if the machine is powered up and the board has powered, you could actually fry the little board inside the foot control. I'm going to pry this open. Now, if you notice on my screwdriver, I have blue tape on it, and that's just because I don't really want to mar up the plastic with the hard metal from my screwdriver, which will actually damage the plastic. The blue tape or painter's tape is going to give me a little bit of cushion against it as I pry it apart. And it's really not that difficult to pry apart. You're going to insert it, as you'll see, and lift up on the one side, and then you'll be able to flex out the other side without too much problem. You do not need to take the whole thing apart. It'll come apart as you pry it open. So the first portions are to take your screwdriver and come up in between the housing on the outside and the inside guts. Now you'll see there's a pin or a post right here that has some extra plastic around it, and all you're really wanting to do is not press on that. You want to press against the housing and get it to flex out so that you can clear this housing over this post. All right? So now you can see how easy that was. Not very difficult. Didn't do any marring on my plastic thanks to the use of my blue tape. So now I'm just going to continue to take this apart simply by sliding it over. Now, keep in mind there are springs inside and there are two catches at the top here, so we need to be cognizant of those. Once I've got this one side off, I can actually turn it over to the other side, and the other side doesn't need as much prying. I can actually use my fingers just to pull it apart. Now I'm going to lift it off carefully. There are two springs. Those two springs can stay in place, or if they settle there, if you pick it up the other direction and you have the spring stuck up in here, that's fine too, but you're just going to leave them into the base, and you're going to set this side apart because this is where we want to work. Unfortunately, these two screws are not the two screws that we want to get to. Two screws that we want to get to are underneath that plastic cover. So we are going to need to take off this spring and take off these two screws here and here so that we can get underneath it. Now, I do want you to notice that if this pin here looks like it's loose, that you want to make sure that it's pushed back in, that it's not walking out. See, I can tug on it, it's not just going to pop out. So you want to make sure that that plug is securely seated inside. You also want to be careful of that plug not to knock it off or not to bend it off when you're taking it apart. It's pretty durable, but better safe than sorry. First things first, we're going to disconnect our spring, and we're going to take it completely off. Now we're going to want to come and take out these two screws, which will take out this plastic holder and this slide mechanism. If you were to plug this in right now, this would trigger the foot control because the resting position with no load on it is all the way to the back, but neutral is actually in the middle. So this would be going down to go for speed, and this would be pulling it back to make it thread cut. So neutral is actually in the middle. It's not all the way back. So I'm actually taking two screws out, and I can set my little plastic piece aside, and now you can see inside here, but I'm going to lift this piece off because this is just a little cover. This is the actual slide mechanism here, and here are the two screws that I'm going to make my adjustment on. So as my foot control is not working properly, maybe it's cutting all the time, maybe it's not cutting all the time, maybe it's not cutting at all, I found that sometimes this board is causing it to bind. And so this slider is just not sliding correctly because it's got a little kilt to it. Maybe it's sitting this way a little bit or sitting this way a little bit. So I have found that if I release these two screws and I push the board as far over to the side as I can get it and then tighten those two screws down, that kind of solves my problem for some of my foot control issues. So let me do that in this model real quick. Remember, we are working with metal screws into plastic, so I don't want to be taking them out. I just want to loosen them up and get the board to slide over, and I'm going to hold it in place and tighten the two screws back down. Now still be cognizant of this little connector here. You don't want to break it off. And we do not need to change any other settings in here, but we do want to be able to hold the board over as we tighten down the screws. So now I've tightened the screws down, and I can feel that my mechanism is sliding fairly nicely. It's going to feel a little gritty because that's just the way the mechanism is going to work, but it's not binding on it. I don't feel that it's going to get stuck any place, and I can gently push it up and down. Now there's going to be some resistance, and that's normal. So now that I've got this all put back together, I can put my cover back on. This has a little indentation in it. That indentation is what goes into the cap top here, or this little cap goes over that little hole. This plastic piece here is just the guide to hide the edge, so we want to make sure that we put it back down in place correctly. You can test it by moving this up and moving this back and forth. You'll also find that it moves smoother once you put this piece on. You're not trying to hold that little piece, so the pressure against that mechanism is cleaner from this mechanism than it is from your fingers just being on it. Now I want to put my plastic cover back on. The plastic cover also acts as a guide for the other side of my slide, so I need to be cognizant of that. Some people like to be able to put it in and then drop the whole thing down into position, so it just depends on how comfortable you are working with the little parts. Remember, at this point, it's just a matter of reassembling. We've tightened everything else down that we need to tighten. We're just putting our covers back on. Recheck our slide to make sure it still feels nice and smooth and even. Now we want to put our spring back on. So we're going to take our spring and hook it back into the opening on the back side of the slide mechanism. And then we're going to pull it over the post and let it sit back in position. So now we want to reassemble our foot. We have our two springs and we have two catches that we have to get to align and talk to each other correctly. Otherwise it's not going to close correctly. It'll just sit on top or it'll be canted. So first things first is let's worry about our springs and getting them into position. I like to work with the top down, or the top of the foot control down, so I can turn it upside down. That way I'm not worried about any of those parts moving or my cord dangling in my way. These are all attached, so they're not going to come apart. It's just a matter of getting them to align and getting it to fall in. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I like to have the bottom on. So I like to start with the bottom on my surface that I can put my springs in, because this has moving parts like the cord and things, and I don't want to have to deal with them flipping around or flopping around. This way, this has no moving parts. It's just a matter of aligning and getting it to snap into position. So I like to start with the bottom on my surface that I can put my springs in, because this has moving parts like the cord and things, and I don't want to have to deal with them flipping around or flopping around. This way, this has no moving parts. It's just a matter of aligning and getting it to snap into position. So first things first is I'm going to tilt it up so I can get it onto the mechanisms. I'm going to tilt it up so I get it caught. So those two pieces are caught. They'll just drop in place for you. If you are unsure about the springs and how they sat, look at how easy they just fall into position for you. If they don't, you can just move them with your finger to get them to go back into position for you. Once they're in position, it's just a matter of snapping the rest back in. Now, a lot of people want to make this more difficult than it is. I'm going to tell you that I find one side goes in easy, the other side's going to go in just as easy, maybe with a little extra prying, but I really don't need to use a screwdriver or anything. I should be able just to push it in and get them to slide over. I just need to take this to my machine and test it to make sure I've accomplished what I was trying to accomplish. So there you have it. A possible 4 or 5 minute fix for the foot control issues that we are experiencing with some of our foot controls for our TL machines.